On August 2, 216 BC, in the sweltering heat of southeastern Italy, 86,000 Roman soldiers marched toward what they believed would be their greatest victory. The largest army Rome had ever assembled moved with the confidence of eagles, proud, unstoppable, destined to crush the Carthaginian invader who had dared to bring war to their doorstep. But waiting for them in the dusty plains near the small town of Cannae was a man whose name would echo through history as the architect of Rome's most devastating defeat. Hannibal Barca, the sworn enemy of Rome, was about to demonstrate a tactical masterpiece so brilliant that military academies would study it for over 2,000 years. In a single afternoon, this Carthaginian general would bring the mighty Roman Empire to its knees, leaving 50,000 Romans dead on the battlefield and Rome itself trembling behind its walls. This is the story of how one man's genius nearly erased Rome from history, and how the empire's darkest hour would forge its greatest strength. But what happened on that blood-soaked field wasn't just a battle. It was a collision of civilizations that would determine whether Rome would rise to dominate the world or crumble into the dust of forgotten empires. To understand the catastrophe at Cannae, we must first journey back to the world of the 3rd century BC, when the Mediterranean was not yet a Roman lake, but a contested sea where two great powers circled each other like gladiators in an arena. Rome, still centuries away from its imperial glory, was a rising republic that had spent 2.5 centuries clawing its way to dominance over the Italian peninsula. Across the sea, in what is now Tunisia, stood Carthage, a maritime empire built on trade, wealth, and naval supremacy that controlled the western Mediterranean like a spider controls its web. These were not mere city-states squabbling over territory. Rome and Carthage represented two fundamentally different visions of power. Rome was a land-based military machine built on the disciplined legions of citizen soldiers who fought not just for conquest, but for the honor of the republic itself. Every Roman male was expected to serve. Military success was the pathway to political power. Their society was structured around the idea that strength came from unity, discipline, and an unshakable belief in Roman superiority. Carthage, by contrast, was a merchant empire. Their wealth came from the sea, from trade routes that stretched from Spain to the eastern Mediterranean, from silver mines in Iberia to the exotic goods of Africa. Where Romans fought with citizen armies, Carthaginians hired mercenaries. Where Romans conquered to settle and govern, Carthaginians sought commercial advantage and tribute. Yet this difference would prove to be both Carthage's weakness and its hidden strength, because it had produced something Rome had never faced: a professional military mind of unprecedented genius. The first war between these titans, known to history as the First Punic War, had lasted 23 brutal years from 264 to 241 BC. It had been primarily a naval conflict, fought over control of Sicily, and Rome had emerged victorious through sheer bloody-minded persistence. The Romans, who had barely known how to build warships at the war's beginning, had literally learned naval warfare by copying captured Carthaginian vessels. They had lost entire fleets to storms and enemy action, only to build new ones and continue fighting. This was Rome's greatest strength, the absolute refusal to admit defeat. But victory had come at a terrible price for Carthage. The defeated empire was forced to pay crushing war reparations of 3,200 talents of silver over 10 years, a sum so vast it would bankrupt most nations. Worse still, Rome had taken advantage of Carthage's weakness to seize the islands of Sardinia and Corsica, adding insult to injury by demanding an additional 1,200 talents in compensation. In Carthage, these humiliations burned in the heart of one man above all others: Hamilcar Barca, the greatest Carthaginian general of the First Punic War. According to the historian Polybius, Hamilcar made his young son swear an oath of eternal hatred against Rome. That boy was Hannibal, and he would grow up with one consuming purpose: to bring Rome to its knees. The child who placed his hand on the sacred altar and swore to be Rome's enemy would become the most dangerous opponent the Republic had ever faced. But how could one man, even a brilliant general, challenge the growing might of Rome? The answer lay in an audacious plan that would take Hannibal across the known world and bring him to Rome's doorstep through a route no Roman could have imagined. After the First Punic War, Hamilcar Barca had led Carthaginian forces to Spain, not just to rebuild his nation's shattered finances through conquest and tribute, but to forge a new kind of army. In the mountains and plains of Iberia, he welded together a force unlike anything the ancient world had seen. A professional military machine combining Carthaginian tactical sophistication with the fierce warrior traditions of Spanish and Celtic tribes, the mobility of Numidian cavalry, and the brute force of African war elephants. When Hamilcar died in 228 BC, command passed first to his son-in-law, then to his eldest son, Hannibal. By 221 BC, at just 26 years old, Hannibal Barca commanded an army that was both a military force and a personal instrument of vengeance. But he was no mere hothead seeking glory. Ancient sources describe him as a military genius who combined tactical brilliance with an almost supernatural ability to inspire loyalty. He spoke multiple languages, could endure the same hardships as his common soldiers, and possessed an intuitive understanding of human psychology that made him as dangerous in negotiation as he was on the battlefield. The spark that ignited the Second Punic War came in 219 BC when Hannibal laid siege to Saguntum, a Spanish city allied to Rome. The Romans demanded his withdrawal. Hannibal refused. When Saguntum fell after an 8-month siege, Rome issued an ultimatum to Carthage: surrender Hannibal or face war. The Carthaginian Senate's response was defiant. They would not abandon their greatest general. What happened next stunned the Roman world. Instead of preparing for another naval war like the first conflict, Hannibal launched the most audacious military campaign in ancient history. In the spring of 218 BC, he marched 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants out of Spain, across southern France, and toward the Alps. His plan was breathtaking in its ambition: to cross the mountains that Romans considered an impassable barrier and bring the war directly to Italy. The Alpine crossing became legendary even in ancient times. For 15 days, Hannibal's army fought their way through narrow mountain passes, enduring rock slides triggered by hostile Celtic tribes, snowstorms that killed men and animals by the hundreds, and terrain so treacherous that entire sections of the army had to build roads by hand. The elephants, those symbols of Carthaginian power, proved nearly useless in the thin mountain air and freezing conditions. Men fell to their deaths from icy precipices, while others died of exposure and exhaustion. But Hannibal's genius wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. He had calculated that the mere appearance of a Carthaginian army in northern Italy would shatter Roman confidence and convince Rome's Italian allies to switch sides. He was partially right. When his battered but still formidable force descended into the Po Valley in late 218 BC, panic spread through Roman territories like wildfire. The Romans were utterly unprepared for this kind of warfare. Their military thinking was straightforward: raise armies, march them toward the enemy, and fight decisive battles until one side was destroyed or surrendered. They had never faced an opponent who could appear anywhere, strike without warning, and disappear before Roman reinforcements could arrive. Hannibal had brought a new kind of warfare to Italy, one that would expose every weakness in the Roman military system. Yet even as Roman armies suffered defeat after defeat in those first months, few could have predicted what was coming. Hannibal was not just winning battles, he was preparing for a masterpiece of military art that would bring Rome closer to destruction than it had ever been. The stage was set for Cannae, but first Rome would have to learn just how dangerous their enemy truly was. The Romans learned the hard way that they were facing an opponent unlike any they had encountered. Hannibal's first victory came at the Battle of Trebia in December 218 BC, where he demonstrated the tactical flexibility that would become his trademark. Feigning a frontal assault, he drew the Romans across an icy river, then unleashed hidden troops on their flanks while his brother Mago emerged from concealment to attack their rear. Of 40,000 Romans and allied troops, fewer than 10,000 escaped, but Trebia was just the beginning. In June 217 BC, at Lake Trasimene in central Italy, Hannibal achieved something that seemed impossible. He made an entire Roman army disappear. Using the early morning mist as cover, he positioned his forces along the hills surrounding the lake's northern shore. When the Roman consul Flaminius led his army of 25,000 men along the lakeside road, they marched straight into the most perfectly executed ambush in military history. The Romans never had a chance to form battle lines. Hannibal's troops struck from three sides simultaneously, driving the panicked Romans into the lake. Flaminius himself was killed in the fighting, struck down by a Gallic warrior who recognized his distinctive armor. In less than 3 hours, an entire Roman army ceased to exist. 15,000 Romans died, and another 10,000 were captured. Hannibal's losses were negligible. Rome reeled from the disaster. For the first time since the Gallic sack of the city more than a century and a half earlier, enemies were roaming freely through Italian territory. Cities that had been loyal Roman allies began to waver. The roads to Rome itself seemed open to this Carthaginian demon who struck like lightning and vanished like smoke. In desperation, the Romans abandoned their normal political system and appointed a dictator. Quintus Fabius Maximus, a man who understood that Rome could not defeat Hannibal in open battle. Fabius implemented a strategy that his enemies called cowardly, but which history would recognize as brilliant. He would shadow Hannibal's army, cut his supply lines, attack his foragers, and avoid pitched battles at all costs. The Romans nicknamed him Cunctator, the delayer. But Fabius understood what his more aggressive colleagues did not. Time was on Rome's side. Hannibal's army, for all its tactical superiority, was slowly weakening. He received no reinforcements from Carthage, whose Senate was more focused on protecting their territories in Spain and Africa than supporting his Italian campaign. Every battle, even every victory, cost him irreplaceable veteran soldiers. His Spanish and Celtic allies fought magnificently, but they were far from home and increasingly tempted by the possibility of returning with their loot. More importantly, Hannibal's strategic gamble wasn't paying off as he had hoped. While some Italian cities and tribes had indeed joined his cause, Rome's core alliance system proved remarkably resilient. The Latin colonies and Roman settlements remained loyal, providing the Republic with a steady stream of manpower and supplies. Rome's greatest strength wasn't its military genius. It was its ability to absorb catastrophic losses and continue fighting. This war of attrition might have continued indefinitely. But the Roman people grew impatient with Fabius's cautious strategy. They wanted decisive action, a glorious victory that would drive the invader from Italian soil forever. When Fabius's term as dictator expired, the Romans elected 2 consuls who promised exactly what the people demanded. Lucius Aemilius Paulus, an experienced general who understood the dangers they faced, and Gaius Terentius Varro, a populist politician who had risen to power by promising to end the war quickly. The stage was set for the climactic confrontation both sides had been anticipating. Hannibal, knowing his position was precarious, actively sought the decisive battle that might break Roman resistance once and for all. The Romans, tired of their own caution, were eager to accommodate him. Neither side could have imagined that their collision would produce not just the greatest tactical victory in military history, but a lesson in the art of war that would be studied by generals from Napoleon to Norman Schwarzkopf. The armies were gathering, and the fate of Rome hung in the balance. In the summer of 216 BC, Both armies converged on the small fortified town of Cannae in southeastern Italy, like pieces on a vast chessboard moving toward their final positions. Hannibal had chosen his ground carefully. Cannae controlled the largest Roman supply depot in southern Italy, a prize so valuable that Rome could not afford to let it remain in enemy hands. By capturing the town, Hannibal had done more than seize supplies. He had issued a challenge that Roman honor demanded they answer. The Roman response was overwhelming in its scale and ambition. Never before had the Republic assembled such a massive force. 8 full legions, each containing about 4,500 heavy infantry, plus an equal number of allied troops, marched south toward Cannae. Supporting them were 2,400 Roman cavalry and 3,600 allied horsemen. In total, 86,400 men, the largest army in Roman history, moved with the confident step of soldiers who believed they were about to end the war in a single crushing blow. Command of this massive force alternated daily between the two consuls, as was Roman custom. Paulus, the veteran, understood that numbers alone would not guarantee victory against Hannibal. He advocated for careful positioning, thorough reconnaissance, and patient maneuvering to force battle on favorable terms. Varro, the politician, argued for immediate attack. The army was so large, he insisted, that tactical finesse was unnecessary. They would simply overwhelm the Carthaginians through sheer weight of numbers. Hannibal, watching the Roman approach from his camp across the Aufidus River, faced a desperate situation that he somehow transformed into opportunity. His army numbered fewer than 50,000 men, barely half the Roman force. Worse, many of his troops were showing signs of war weariness after 2 years of continuous campaigning. His Spanish infantry, the backbone of his army, remained loyal and disciplined, but his Gallic allies were notoriously unreliable. Some had already deserted, taking their weapons and knowledge of his plans with them. Yet Hannibal possessed advantages that couldn't be counted in mere numbers. His army was a perfectly balanced instrument of war, with each component designed to complement the others. His heavy infantry might be outnumbered, but they were veterans of a dozen battles, men who trusted their general absolutely and had learned to fight as a single deadly organism. His cavalry, led by the brilliant Numidian horsemen of North Africa, was superior to the Roman mounted forces in both skill and numbers, a crucial advantage that Hannibal intended to exploit fully. Most importantly, Hannibal had something his enemies lacked: complete unity of command and a tactical plan so audacious that its very boldness might ensure success. While the Romans debated strategy and alternated command, Hannibal was crafting a masterpiece of military art based on intimate knowledge of Roman psychology and fighting methods. The Romans always attacked straight ahead. It was their strength and their weakness. Roman legions were designed for frontal assaults, their manipular system allowing them to maintain pressure while fresh troops rotated forward to replace the exhausted. This system had conquered Italy through disciplined, relentless pressure applied at the point of contact. But what if that strength could be turned into a trap? On August 1st, with Paulus in command, the Romans deployed their vast army but declined to attack, waiting for more favorable conditions. Hannibal, frustrated by the delay, attempted to provoke battle by sending his Numidian cavalry to harass the Roman water-bearers near the river. Skirmishing continued throughout the day, but Paulus refused to be drawn into the full engagement that Hannibal desperately needed. But the next day, August 2nd, command passed to Varro, and everything changed. The populist consul had built his political career on promises of aggressive action, and he was not about to disappoint his supporters by showing what they would consider cowardice. Despite Paulus's protests, despite the advice of his more experienced officers, Varro ordered the army to cross the Aufidus River and deploy for battle. As the Roman legions formed their lines in the dusty plain, they presented a spectacle that should have struck terror into any enemy's heart. 86,000 men in perfect formation, their bronze armor gleaming in the morning sun, their standards proud and numerous as a forest of oak trees. They had come to end the war, and they possessed the strength to crush any army that dared stand against them. Yet across the battlefield, one man watched their deployment with satisfaction rather than fear. Hannibal Barca was about to spring the greatest trap in military history. If you're enjoying this deep dive into one of history's most brilliant military minds, consider subscribing for more stories that bring the ancient world to life. As dawn broke on August 2nd, 216 BC, Hannibal deployed his army in a formation so unconventional that his own officers questioned his sanity. Traditional military wisdom dictated that the strongest troops should occupy the center of the line, where the decisive clash would occur. Instead, Hannibal placed his weakest forces, the unreliable Gallic and Spanish levies, directly in the center, while positioning his elite African heavy infantry on the wings, initially hidden behind the screening troops. But this apparent madness had method. Hannibal had studied Roman tactics for years, and he understood their fundamental predictability. The Romans would concentrate their attack on what appeared to be the enemy's main battle line. They would push forward with irresistible force, driving deep into the Carthaginian center. And in doing so, they would walk directly into the trap he had prepared for them. The Carthaginian center was deliberately formed in a convex arc, bulging forward toward the Romans like a bow drawn taut. This wasn't a sign of strength, it was bait. Hannibal had instructed his Celtic and Spanish troops to give ground slowly when the Romans attacked, drawing the legions deeper into the arc while the African infantry remained hidden and motionless on the flanks. Meanwhile, on the wings, Hannibal had positioned his true weapons of victory. His Numidian and Spanish cavalry, vastly superior to their Roman counterparts, would sweep away the enemy horsemen and then circle behind the Roman army like wolves closing on their prey. Everything depended on timing, coordination, and the discipline of troops who had learned to trust their commander's genius even when his orders seemed to court disaster. Varro, oblivious to the trap being prepared, deployed his massive army in traditional Roman fashion, but with one crucial modification that would prove catastrophic. Recognizing that his forces greatly outnumbered the enemy, he compressed his manipular formations, packing his legions into a dense, narrow column that would deliver maximum impact at the point of contact. Instead of the usual spacing that allowed flexibility and maneuver, he created a battering ram of human flesh and bronze that would smash through any resistance. This decision revealed both Roman arrogance and their fundamental misunderstanding of their enemy. They saw only numbers and thought victory was guaranteed. They failed to recognize that Hannibal had spent 2 years studying their methods, identifying their weaknesses, and preparing for exactly this moment. At approximately 11 a.m., with the summer sun climbing toward its zenith and the heat beginning to shimmer off the dusty plain, Varro gave the order to advance. 86,000 Roman soldiers stepped forward in unison, their hobnailed sandals raising clouds of dust, their war cries echoing across the battlefield like thunder. The sound must have been terrifying, the disciplined roar of the largest army Rome had ever fielded, moving with mechanical precision toward what seemed like inevitable victory. Hannibal's center received the Roman assault exactly as planned. The Celtic and Spanish troops, following their orders, began to give ground under the tremendous pressure. But they didn't break. Not yet. Instead, they conducted a fighting withdrawal, maintaining their formation while slowly bending backward like a bow under stress. The Romans, sensing victory, pressed harder, driving deeper into the gradually forming pocket. From his position on a small hill overlooking the battlefield, Hannibal watched his trap unfold with the patience of a master craftsman. His weakest troops were performing magnificently, absorbing punishment while maintaining enough cohesion to keep the Romans advancing in the desired direction. On the flanks, his cavalry was systematically destroying the Roman horsemen, clearing the way for the encirclement that would decide the battle. But the most crucial moment was yet to come. As the Roman legions pushed deeper into the Carthaginian center, they were gradually losing their formation. The compressed deployment that Varro had ordered was working against them, as the rear ranks pressed forward, crushing the front ranks together and eliminating the flexibility that was the Roman army's greatest tactical advantage. The legionnaires in the front lines began to realize something was wrong. They were advancing, yes, but the enemy wasn't breaking. Instead, they were being channeled into an increasingly narrow space, surrounded on three sides by enemies who seemed to be retreating in perfect order. And behind them, a new and terrifying sound was beginning to echo across the battlefield. The thunder of hooves as Hannibal's cavalry completed their destruction of the Roman wings and began their deadly wheel toward the rear of the trapped legions. The moment of truth arrived when Hannibal's cavalry, having shattered the Roman horsemen on both flanks, began their devastating wheel toward the rear of the legions. The Numidian riders, masters of mounted warfare whose ancestors had been riding across the deserts of North Africa for centuries, moved with a fluidity and coordination that the heavier Roman cavalry could never match. Led by Hasdrubal, Hannibal's cavalry commander, they swept across the battlefield like a scythe through grain. But it was the simultaneous movement of the African heavy infantry that transformed a successful cavalry charge into military art. These were Hannibal's best troops, professional soldiers armed with captured Roman equipment and organized in the Roman style but trained to fight with Carthaginian tactical flexibility. They had been waiting in concealment behind the screening troops, motionless as statues while the battle raged before them. Now, at Hannibal's signal, they revealed themselves and began their advance. Moving in perfect synchronization from both flanks, the African infantry closed on the increasingly compressed Roman formation like the jaws of some massive predator. The Romans, packed so tightly in their pursuit of the retreating center that individual soldiers could barely raise their weapons, suddenly found themselves attacked from three sides simultaneously. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical assault. Roman soldiers, trained from childhood to believe in their invincibility, discovered they were trapped in a pocket of death with no possibility of escape. The disciplined formations that had conquered Italy began to disintegrate as panic spread through the ranks like fire through dry grass. In the center, the Celtic and Spanish troops who had been conducting their fighting withdrawal suddenly stopped retreating. Their apparent weakness had been revealed as strength, their retreat as tactical genius. Now they turned and advanced against Romans who were already engaged on their flanks and rear, completing an encirclement so perfect that military historians would study it for millennia. The Romans found themselves caught in what would later be called a double envelopment, surrounded on all sides with no line of retreat. 86,000 men, the pride of Rome, were trapped in a space barely large enough for half their number. They couldn't maneuver, couldn't retreat, could barely fight. The legionnaires in the rear ranks didn't even know they were under attack until Carthaginian spears began cutting them down from behind. Consul Paulus, who had opposed the battle but fought with characteristic Roman courage once it began, was killed trying to rally his men near the center of the dying formation. His death symbolized the destruction of everything the Romans had thought invincible about themselves. Around him, the greatest army in Roman history was being methodically annihilated. Yet even in their death throes, the Romans displayed the discipline that had built their empire. Small groups of legionnaires formed defensive circles, shields locked together, fighting back to back against impossible odds. They sold their lives dearly, but they could not escape the mathematical certainty of Hannibal's trap. For every Carthaginian who fell, 3 or 4 Romans died. The slaughter continued for hours under the merciless Italian sun. Ancient sources describe the battlefield as so thick with Roman dead that Hannibal's soldiers had to climb over piles of corpses to continue the killing. The Aufidus River, witnesses reported, ran red with Roman blood for days after the battle. By late afternoon, resistance had virtually ceased. Of the 86,000 Romans who had marched confidently to battle that morning, fewer than 15,000 would live to see another dawn. Most of these were from the rear ranks who managed to break free in the early stages of the encirclement. The rest, nearly 70,000 of Rome's finest soldiers, lay dead on the field at Cannae. Among the Roman dead were Consul Paulus, both quaestors, 29 military tribunes, and 80 senators or men of senatorial rank. An entire generation of Roman leadership had been wiped out in a single afternoon. It was the greatest military disaster in Roman history. A defeat so complete that it seemed to herald the end of the Roman Republic itself. As the sun set over the corpse-strewn battlefield, Hannibal stood among the dead and surveyed his masterpiece. He had achieved something no enemy of Rome had ever accomplished: the complete destruction of a Roman army through tactical genius alone. His losses were minimal, perhaps 6,000 men, mostly from his Celtic allies. Rome's losses were catastrophic beyond measure. The question now was whether the Roman Republic could survive such devastation, or whether Cannae would mark the beginning of Rome's final collapse. In the immediate aftermath of the slaughter, as darkness fell over the battlefield of Cannae, Hannibal faced the most crucial decision of his military career. His cavalry commander Maharbal approached him with urgent advice that would echo through history. "Give me the cavalry, and in 5 days you shall dine in the capital." Rome lay defenseless, its army destroyed, its leadership decimated. A forced march could bring Carthaginian forces to the gates of the city before the Romans could organize any meaningful defense. But Hannibal hesitated. This moment of hesitation would be debated by military historians for over 2,000 years. Was it caution or strategic wisdom? The answer reveals both the brilliance and the limitations of even the greatest military mind in ancient history. Hannibal understood what Maharbal did not: that capturing Rome would not necessarily end the war. Unlike other ancient civilizations, Rome was not a typical city-state that would surrender once its capital fell. The Roman Republic was a confederation of hundreds of cities and tribes throughout Italy, bound together by military colonies, shared citizenship, and a complex web of alliances. Even if Rome itself fell, the war could continue from any number of fortified cities throughout the peninsula. Moreover, Hannibal's army, despite its stunning victory, was in no condition for an immediate siege. His forces were exhausted from the battle, laden with loot from the Roman camp, and scattered across the battlefield collecting spoils and tending to their wounded. A siege of Rome would require preparation, siege engines, and sustained supply lines, none of which Hannibal possessed. Perhaps most importantly, Hannibal was still a Carthaginian general, not an independent warlord. His ultimate goal was not personal glory, but the restoration of Carthaginian power and the humbling of Rome. A direct assault on the city might galvanize Roman resistance rather than break it. Instead, he chose a different strategy: to use his victory at Cannae as psychological warfare, designed to shatter the Roman alliance system and force Rome to negotiate from a position of weakness. The immediate effects seemed to justify his decision. News of the disaster at Cannae spread through Italy like wildfire, and the reaction was everything Hannibal could have hoped for. In Capua, the largest city in southern Italy after Rome, the ruling class voted to ally with Carthage. Throughout southern Italy, cities that had been loyal Roman allies for generations began to reconsider their allegiances. The psychological impact on Rome itself was even more dramatic. When the survivors of Cannae straggled back to the city with news of the disaster, panic swept through the population. Temples were filled with terrified citizens making offerings to the gods. The Senate, having lost so many of its members in the battle, struggled to maintain order. Some citizens fled the city entirely, convinced that Hannibal's arrival was imminent. Yet it was precisely in this moment of supreme crisis that Rome revealed the qualities that would ultimately make it master of the Mediterranean world. Rather than seeking peace negotiations or surrendering in despair, The Romans doubled down on resistance. The Senate issued a decree that would become legendary. No one was allowed to speak of surrender, and any citizen who proposed peace negotiations would be executed as a traitor. More remarkably, Rome began the seemingly impossible task of rebuilding its shattered military power. Emergency levies were called throughout Roman territory. Slaves were freed to serve in the legions, something unprecedented in Roman history. Boys as young as 16 and men over 46 were conscripted. Even gladiators and debtors were recruited into emergency units. The Romans also displayed a grim pragmatism that revealed their true character. When Hannibal sent a delegation to Rome offering to ransom the Roman prisoners taken at Cannae, the Senate voted to refuse. They would not pay ransom for soldiers who had allowed themselves to be captured, even though many of these men were from the most prominent families in Rome. This harsh decision sent a clear message. Rome would fight on regardless of cost, and Roman soldiers were expected to die rather than surrender. Within months of the catastrophe at Cannae, Rome had fielded new armies and resumed offensive operations. The republic that seemed on the verge of collapse was revealing a resilience that would ultimately prove more decisive than any tactical brilliance. Hannibal had won the greatest victory in military history, but he was about to learn that destroying a Roman army was very different from destroying Rome itself. The years following Cannae would prove that Hannibal's tactical masterpiece, brilliant as it was, could not overcome Rome's strategic advantages. While the Carthaginian general had demonstrated unprecedented military genius, the Roman Republic possessed something that proved even more valuable: an institutional structure designed to absorb catastrophic losses and continue functioning. Rome's response to Cannae was unlike anything seen in the ancient world. Most civilizations, having suffered such a devastating defeat, would have sought peace at almost any price. Instead, Rome entered what can only be described as a state of total war. The Romans understood instinctively what later military theorists would formulate as doctrine: that wars are won not by single battles, no matter how brilliant, but by the ability to sustain prolonged conflict until the enemy's will is broken. The Roman military system, which had seemed so rigid and predictable to Hannibal, proved remarkably adaptable in the face of necessity. New tactical formations were developed to counter Carthaginian advantages. Roman cavalry, always their weak point, was reinforced with allied horsemen from Gaul and Germany. Most importantly, Rome learned to avoid the kind of massive set-piece battles where Hannibal's genius could be fully displayed. Instead of seeking another Cannae, Roman commanders adopted what became known as the Fabian strategy, named after Quintus Fabius Maximus, the delayer. They would shadow Hannibal's forces, attack his supply lines, harass his foragers, and engage only when conditions were overwhelmingly favorable. This strategy required patience and discipline, qualities that Romans possessed in abundance. Meanwhile, Rome's alliance system, the foundation of its power in Italy, proved more resilient than Hannibal had anticipated. While some cities like Capua did defect to Carthage, the majority remained loyal. The Latin colonies, the backbone of Roman control, stood firm. More importantly, Rome's treatment of its allies had created genuine loyalty rather than mere submission. Unlike Carthaginian territories, which were ruled as commercial assets, Roman allies enjoyed various forms of citizenship and shared in the profits of conquest. The strategic situation gradually shifted in Rome's favor as the war continued. While Hannibal remained undefeated in Italy, he was increasingly isolated. Carthage, focused on protecting its territories in Spain and Africa, provided minimal reinforcements. When Hannibal's brother Hasdrubal finally brought a relief army from Spain in 207 BC, it was destroyed at the Battle of the Metaurus River before it could unite with Hannibal's forces. Perhaps most critically, Rome began to take the war to Carthage's own territories. In Spain, the young Publius Cornelius Scipio, later known as Scipio Africanus, proved that Romans could learn from their enemies. Studying Hannibal's tactics, Scipio developed his own innovations in battlefield command. His victory at the Battle of Ilipa in 206 BC used Hannibal's own double envelopment against the Carthaginians, demonstrating that tactical genius was not the exclusive property of any single nation. The psychological impact of Cannae, which had initially favored Carthage, gradually turned against Hannibal. His inability to follow up on his greatest victory with decisive strategic gains damaged his reputation among potential Italian allies. Cities that might have joined him in 216 BC remained loyal to Rome by 210 BC, recognizing that the war's momentum had shifted. By 204 BC, Rome had not only survived Hannibal's invasion but had carried the war to Africa itself. Scipio's landing in North Africa forced Carthage to recall Hannibal from Italy to defend the homeland. The great general who had terrified Rome for 16 years was finally forced to abandon his campaign, leaving Italy undefeated in battle but strategically unsuccessful. The final confrontation came at the Battle of Zama in 202 BC, where Scipio defeated Hannibal using tactics learned from the master himself. The student had surpassed the teacher, not through superior genius, but through the institutional advantages of a system designed for prolonged warfare. The peace treaty that ended the Second Punic War was harsh beyond measure. Carthage was forbidden to wage war without Roman permission, forced to pay enormous reparations and reduced to a mere city-state. Hannibal, the architect of Cannae, went into exile, spending his remaining years as a fugitive from Roman vengeance until he took his own life rather than face capture. Yet in a strange way, Cannae had made Rome stronger. The disaster had forced the Republic to confront its weaknesses and develop new strengths. The Romans who emerged from the Second Punic War were harder, more adaptable, and more confident than those who had marched to Cannae. They had learned that they could survive anything, and that knowledge would carry them to mastery of the Mediterranean world. Our Legacy and Reflection, Block 9, 650-750 words. The Battle of Cannae stands as perhaps the most studied tactical engagement in military history. Its lessons dissected in war colleges from West Point to Sandhurst for over 2 millennia. Yet its true significance extends far beyond the realm of military science. Cannae represents a watershed moment in human civilization, the point at which Rome's character was forged in the crucible of near destruction and emerged stronger than before. For military strategists, Cannae remains the gold standard of tactical perfection. Napoleon Bonaparte, himself no stranger to battlefield genius, called it the most perfect battle ever fought. The German General Staff studied Hannibal's double envelopment extensively, applying its principles in their own campaigns during both world wars. General Norman Schwarzkopf explicitly cited Cannae as inspiration for the left hook maneuver that devastated Iraqi forces during the Gulf War of 1991. But the battle's influence extends beyond professional soldiers. Cannae entered the vocabulary of strategic thinking as a metaphor for any situation where apparent strength becomes vulnerability, where an enemy's aggression can be turned against them. Business schools teach case studies based on Hannibal's principles of misdirection and delayed gratification. Political scientists analyze Rome's institutional response to crisis as a model for democratic resilience. The psychological dimensions of Cannae continue to fascinate scholars of human behavior. How does a civilization respond when faced with existential threat? Rome's answer, absolute refusal to surrender combined with systematic adaptation, became a template for national survival that echoes through history. When Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany in 1940, Winston Churchill consciously invoked Roman precedent, declaring that the British Empire would never surrender regardless of cost. Modern military historians increasingly recognize that Hannibal's tactical brilliance, stunning as it was, ultimately illustrated the limitations of purely military solutions to strategic problems. Cannae was perfect as a battle, But it could not solve the fundamental challenge Hannibal faced: how to defeat an enemy whose strength lay not in any single army, but in an entire system of governance, alliance, and resource mobilization. Rome's response to Cannae reveals something profound about the nature of institutional strength. While individual brilliance can achieve spectacular short-term results, sustainable power comes from systems that can absorb failure, learn from defeat, and continue functioning even when key leaders are lost. The Romans who rebuilt their armies after Cannae were not necessarily more intelligent than Hannibal, but they represented a collective intelligence that proved more durable than individual genius. The battle also demonstrates the dangerous seduction of tactical perfection. Hannibal's masterpiece at Cannae may have actually hindered his strategic objectives by convincing him that military genius alone could overcome systemic disadvantages. His subsequent campaigns in Italy, while tactically successful, never achieved the political breakthrough that Cannae seemed to promise. The perfect battle became the enemy of effective strategy. For Rome, Cannae became a foundational myth that shaped the Republic's identity for generations. Roman children learned about the disaster as a lesson in the consequences of overconfidence and the rewards of perseverance. The phrase Hannibal ante portas, Hannibal at the gates, entered Latin literature as shorthand for existential threat, while the Roman response became a source of national pride that sustained the Republic through centuries of expansion. The human cost of Cannae, 70,000 dead in a single afternoon, reminds us that tactical brilliance and strategic wisdom are written in blood. Each of those Roman soldiers who died in the dust of southern Italy was someone's son, husband, or father. Their sacrifice, largely forgotten by history, was the price of the lessons that Cannae taught. Military genius, however elegant, is ultimately about the organized application of violence on a massive scale. Perhaps most remarkably, Cannae demonstrates that decisive battles are not always strategically decisive. Despite achieving tactical perfection, Hannibal ultimately lost the war. Despite suffering catastrophic defeat, Rome ultimately conquered the Mediterranean. The battle that seemed to change everything changed nothing fundamental about the balance of power between the two civilizations. This paradox contains a sobering lesson for our own time: that spectacular victories and devastating defeats may be less important than the underlying strengths and weaknesses of the systems that produce them. Rome's ability to survive Cannae stemmed from qualities developed over centuries: institutional flexibility, alliance management, and above all, the collective determination to continue fighting regardless of cost. In the end, Cannae stands as both a monument to human ingenuity and a warning about its limitations. Hannibal's tactical masterpiece will be studied as long as humans wage war, but Rome's strategic response offers perhaps the more valuable lesson: that true strength lies not in avoiding defeat, but in the capacity to endure it and emerge stronger than before. Our legacy and reflection, Block 10, 556 words. Today, as we face our own civilizational challenges, the story of Cannae offers insights that transcend its ancient context. In an age of rapid technological change and global uncertainty, the battle raises fundamental questions about the nature of strength, the value of institutions, and the relationship between individual brilliance and collective resilience. Consider how Hannibal's situation mirrors that of modern disruptive innovators who challenge established systems through technological or tactical superiority. Like many startups that achieve initial success against established corporations, Hannibal possessed advantages in flexibility, innovation, and focused execution. His army was lean, adaptable, and led by unquestioned genius. But Rome represented something different: an ecosystem of interconnected institutions, relationships, and resources that could absorb disruption and adapt over time. The parallel extends to our current debates about artificial intelligence, automation, and technological disruption. Individual innovations, however brilliant, must ultimately confront the challenge of scaling within existing systems and institutions. Hannibal's tactical perfection could not overcome Rome's strategic depth, just as technological breakthroughs must navigate the complex realities of regulation, infrastructure, and social acceptance. Rome's response to Cannae also offers a template for institutional resilience in the face of crisis. When faced with existential threat, the Roman system demonstrated several key characteristics that modern organizations might emulate. Immediate acknowledgement of the crisis without denial or blame shifting. Systematic analysis of what went wrong and why. Rapid implementation of necessary changes regardless of tradition or comfort. And above all, absolute commitment to long-term survival over short-term convenience. The Romans didn't spend time lamenting their losses or seeking scapegoats for the disaster. Instead, they immediately began the practical work of rebuilding while simultaneously implementing reforms designed to prevent similar catastrophes. This combination of resilience and adaptability, often called anti-fragility by modern theorists, enabled Rome to emerge from crisis stronger than before. Yet the story of Cannae also contains warnings about the costs of such resilience. Rome's response to the crisis required enormous sacrifices from its citizens and allies. The freedoms and prosperity that Romans had enjoyed were temporarily suspended in service of survival. The question for modern societies is whether democratic institutions can maintain the unity and discipline necessary for long-term strategic thinking without sacrificing the values that make them worth preserving. The battle's most profound lesson may be about the nature of victory itself. Hannibal achieved what appeared to be total victory at Cannae, yet this triumph ultimately contributed to his strategic defeat. His perfect battle convinced him that Roman resistance could be broken through military means alone, leading him to neglect the political and diplomatic efforts that might have succeeded where force failed. This suggests that in complex systems, whether ancient empires or modern global challenges, apparent victories can be misleading. Climate change, pandemic response, economic inequality, and technological disruption all require sustained, systematic approaches rather than single dramatic solutions. The search for silver bullets, for perfect battles that will solve complex problems once and for all, may distract from the patient work of building resilient institutions and sustainable solutions. As we face our own uncertainties, perhaps the most valuable insight from Cannae is this: that civilizations, like individuals, are ultimately defined not by their moments of triumph or disaster, but by their response to both. Rome's greatness lay not in avoiding defeat, but in learning from it. Hannibal's tragedy was not his ultimate failure, but his inability to recognize that tactical brilliance, however perfect, cannot substitute for strategic wisdom. The dust has long since settled on the battlefield of Cannae, but the questions it raises remain eternally relevant. In our own time of rapid change and growing challenges, we might ask ourselves, are we building institutions capable of surviving our own Cannae moments? Are we developing the collective wisdom to turn crisis into opportunity? And perhaps most importantly, when our perfect plans inevitably fail, will we have the strength to endure, adapt, and ultimately prevail?